children's plasticity made kids much more promising candidates for reform than adults. Orphan asylums, houses of refuge, and reform schools were to rectify the failures of impoverished families, insulate children from a contaminating social environment, and shape their character by instilling habits of sobriety, industry, and self-discipline. During the decades following the Civil War, there was a widespread fear that the American family was in crisis. Many factors contributed to this sense of anxiety, including the discovery that the United States had the highest divorce rate in the Western world, and that the birth rate of native-born white women was falling sharply and lagging far behind that of immigrants and non-whites. There was a growing sense that government needed to step in to protect children, who needed to be regarded as rights holders in a very special sense. Children, in this view, had a right to protection from physical cruelty, neglect, sexual exploitation, immorality, and a host of other ails. Government and private philanthropies had a duty, according to an emerging body of thought, to protect children by criminalizing abuse and neglect, raising the age of consent, and suppressing white slavery, that is prostitution, and obscenity. In retrospect, the limitations of child protection during the Gilded Age are striking. For instance, in the name of killing the Indian and saving the man, hundreds of Native American children were separated from their parents and placed in boarding schools, where they were denied the right to wear Native dress, speak Native languages, or practice Native religions. In general, the late 19th century child savers, as the reformers called themselves, were much more concerned with immorality than with poverty. The reformers tended to confuse neglect and abuse with conditions of life under poverty and to ignore the root causes of poverty. Even though it is certainly true that the poor and working class were able to use reforms for their own purposes, the effect of many of these reforms were to constrain and regulate young people's lives and to police working class and immigrant families. In 1905, the Progressive Era reformer Florence Kelley asserted that a right to childhood existed. One of the most important catchphrases of the Progressive Era, the right to childhood, involved the notion that all children, regardless of class, had a right to a secure, sheltered, middle-class childhood. Through the establishment of the Children's Bureau, the world's first public agency devoted to children's needs, as well as efforts to reduce infant and maternal mortality, abolish child labor, build urban playgrounds, expand access to kindergartens and high schools, and address the problem of juvenile delinquency, the Progressive Era greatly expanded the notion that childhood was a special period of life, that children had special needs and required special treatment, and that social policy should address the psychological, hygienic, and emotional needs of the whole child, rather than simply rescuing dependent and delinquent children. Of course, one of the key reforms of the Progressive Era was the invention of the juvenile court, embracing the notion that juvenile delinquency was a social product of faulty parenting and a toxic social environment. Reformers lobbied for the establishment of a separate court system for juveniles where judges would make use of discretion, including probation, parole, and indeterminate sentencing to rehabilitate youthful offenders. Yet this stress on judicial discretion also had a number of negative consequences that we will discuss later in this conference. Above all, a lack of concern for due process and a tendency for judges to incorporate their own biases and prejudices in decision-making. In retrospect, the limitations of Progressive Era reform are striking. The Children's Bureau, for example, opposed the dissemination of birth control information and the provision of daycare for children, which it associated with neglectful mothering. Yet even though the progressive era's proposals to improve children's well-being were anything but radical, they encountered vigorous opposition, especially from physicians who feared federal encroachment into the practice of medicine, from the Catholic Church and private charities hostile to government intrusion into the family, and from businesses that relied on child labor. The limitations of progressive view are especially glaring in regard to children defined as feeble-minded. As many as 15 to over 40% of those identified as feeble-minded were confined to institutions. Others were placed in special classes or denied schooling altogether. By 1930, 27 states provided for the sterilization of feeble-minded girls. Limitation was also evident in terms of public assistance to low-income families with dependent children. Only mothers deemed worthy were supported. Often aid was limited exclusively to widows. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, federal policy was far more concerned with youth, aged 16 to 25, than with what we would normally consider to be children. With the sole exception of aid to dependent children, the program that later generations would call welfare, most New Deal programs focused on the transition of adolescents and young adults into the workforce, reflecting the large birth cohort of the 19-teens and 20s which entered adolescence in the 1930s. Nevertheless, the New Deal did have a significant impact on children's lives, especially the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which prohibited work for children under 16 and limited work hours for those 16 and 17. It had the practical effect of extending the span of childhood to the age of 18, a trend reinforced by the increasing number of kids who remained in high school through graduation. In 1935, 10-year-old Billy Gobitis and his 12-year-old sister Lillian, who were members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, refused to salute the American flag in school, convinced that it amounted to the worship of a false idol, violating the law of God. The two kids were expelled for insubordination, and in 1940, the Supreme Court, by a vote of 8-1, upheld the expulsion, ruling that the school district had a right to compel students to salute the flag as a symbol of national unity. 3 years later, when the nation was embroiled in World War II, the court reversed itself. In the case of the West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, the court voted 6-3 that requiring students to salute the flag when this violated their religious beliefs infringed upon their constitutional rights. During the 1940s, a number of prominent books invoked the phrase children's rights. In general, the phrase involved enumerating children's needs, including a need for education, a need for play, a need to be loved and cared for. But by the 1960s and early 1970s, child advocates had a different idea in mind. They wanted to award minors many of the same legal rights as adults, including the right to make medical or educational decisions on their own, and a right to have their voices heard in disputes over adoption, custody, divorce, termination of parental rights, or child abuse. And this notion received its most eloquent statement in Harry Blackmun's opinion, 1976, in Planned Parenthood versus Missouri, which granted a minor the right to abortion without parental consent. He said, "Constitutional rights do not mature and come into being magically only when one attains the state-defined age of majority. Minors, as well as adults, are protected by the Constitution and possess constitutional rights." During the 1960s and early 1970s, the children's rights movement was one of many movements to empower and liberate groups whose civil rights had historically been circumscribed. Issues that the courts addressed included, of course, abortion, corporal punishment, involuntary commitment in mental hospitals,